Who did you hear that from?
Dewey.
Dewey. Okay.
Yeah, he said you'd gone to the seminary, and then now you're an architect, and you're doing, among other things, church architecture, and that your dad was in Ellis Creek Beach. He was born in Beach. How about that?
And I'm sure you
I just didn't. I met him. I mean, I know him. But I just didn't.
no reason you would have. I don't scream.
It's the chair is lower. I was trying to figure out how to raise it, but it's not working. So I have to sit like this the whole time. The chair is so low. The chair's lower.
Get the one at the end.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the September 10th, 2015 regular session of the Design Development Review Commission. The commission is made up of volunteers with expertise or interest in historic preservation and design. We generally meet on the second Thursday of the month to review cases. The commission is supported by the city's urban planning and historic preservation staff who are here. And please let them know if you have any questions. Just take care not to impede the proceedings. The meeting generally proceeds with staff calling the case and describing it. The applicant may also come forward to add to the basic description of the request if necessary. And if so, please try to keep your presentation to less than 10 minutes. The commissioners will then have the opportunity to ask questions. After this period, I will ask if there's anyone in the audience who wishes to speak for or against a proposal, and audience comments will be kept to 2 minutes per person. If there is anyone wishing to do so, the applicant will have an opportunity to respond, and this rebuttal shall be kept to 5 minutes. In most of the cases, we will make a decision tonight after all information has been presented. If your case is denied, or if you feel that our decision was made in error, you and anyone with standing have the opportunity to appeal it within 30 days of the decision. All decisions of this commission are based on existing guidelines and ordinances. If you plan to speak about a specific project, you must have signed in. The sheet is at the back of the room or at the podium. Please note that these meetings are streamed live, recorded, and broadcast. So please use discretion with any personal information you may choose to share in the course of the proceedings. It is important also that all testimony and discussion by all parties, including commissioners, be centered on and relative to the pertinent guidelines and ordinances. For all persons who wish to participate, would you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you affirm to tell the truth in these proceedings? Have a seat, please. Staff will now call the roll call.
Mr. Bachnight? Ms. Gray?
Here.
Mr. Gressett?
Present.
Mr. Herger?
Here.
Mr. Cohn?
Here.
Mr. Powell?
Here.
Mr. Savory?
Here.
And Mr. Nguyen.
Here.
We have quorum.
Thank you very much. Will you please read or tell us if the agenda still stands?
We've had a few changes to the agenda since publication. Under the urban part of the agenda, 617 Divine Street, which was a request for approval for new construction of a parking garage in the Innovista Design District, has been withdrawn for the moment. Canalside Phase 3, next on the urban agenda, which is both a request for site plan approval for 6 new buildings there, as well as for design approval for the buildings in the City Center Design Development District, has been changed to an information-only presentation. Under the historic portion of the agenda, 1501 Lady Street, which is a request for preliminary approval for the Bailey Bill and design changes to a building, an individual landmark, has been deferred. 1218 Daly Street, which is a request for approval for exterior changes in the Melrose Heights Oaklawn Architectural Conservation District, has been withdrawn. And then 1528, a request for approval for signage for an individual landmark, and 912 Lady Street, request for approval for exterior changes in the West Gervais Street Historic Commercial District, have been moved to the consent agenda. 1500 Main Street, which is a request for design approval for exterior changes to an individual landmark, has been withdrawn.
Thank you. The consent agenda, as the DDRC uses or reviews it, is used to approve non-controversial or routine matters by a single motion and vote. Examples of such items include residential site improvements, such as fences, minor exterior changes, or signage. If a member of the DDRC or the general public wants to discuss an item on the consent agenda at the beginning of the meeting, that item is removed from the consent agenda and considered during the meeting. The DDRC then approves the remaining consent agenda items. So at this time, ma'am, would you please read the consent agenda in full, please?
Certainly. Under the consent agenda, we have 912 Lady Street, a request for a certificate of design approval for exterior changes in the West Gervais Street Historic Commercial District, 1528 Blanding Street, which is a request for a certificate of design approval for signage to an individual landmark.
And we have also the Blanding, yes, 1528, 912 Lady. Very good. If that being so, is there anyone wishing to remove an item from the consent agenda? Commissioners, no? Is there a motion to accept the consent agenda as it stands?
Yes, sir. I make a motion that we accept the 2 items on the consent agenda.
Very good. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Any discussion? Will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Balknight? Ms. Great?
Yes.
Mr. Gressett?
Yes.
Mr. Herder?
Yes.
Mr. Cohn? Mr. Powell?
Yes.
Mr. Savory?
Yes.
Mr. Nguyen?
Yes.
The motion passes.
Very good. Thank you. We'll move on now to the regular agenda. And would you call the first case, please?
The first case on the regular agenda is in the City Center Design Development District. This is 1221 to 1301 UG Street, 401 to 433 Gervais Street. This is a project that you have seen recently. Last month, they were here presenting. This is a 6.5 acre parcel at the corner of UG and Gervais, formerly the Klein Iron and Steel site. This proposal is for the first 2 mixed-use buildings and associated structured parking and site infrastructure work for an overall development plan, which will include 2 additional buildings in the future. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over. We've got Russ Davis, the developer, is here, and also his architect, Jeff Davis. So they're going to come up. They've brought a presentation to show you, and I'll just let them take it from here.
Ladies and gentlemen of the commission, thank you once again for considering our proposal. I think you will find, I hope you will find, that we've made a concerted effort to address experience made by you, and to a great extent, spent a lot more time with staff over the last 30 days to make sure that we fully understood all the concepts we had. So I will turn it over to Jeff Davis. I would only ask, I'll make one further comment, and that is that we are moving as expeditiously as possible, and would appreciate your consideration of an approval when the time is appropriate. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hello again. As Russ said, we've made considerable effort over the last 30 days to work with staff and to address what we thought were some good, compelling comments at the last meeting. So I will jump into it. Rather than proceed according to the comments, I thought it might be easier to walk around the buildings and address how we've accommodated comments, first on Building 1 and then on Building 2. This is an overall plan of both buildings, of the entire site, with areas redlined that are specific to the areas we paid additional attention to. I think generally, if I was to make an overall observation, I think that the comments were, generally about the finer grain details of the pedestrian experience around each building, and a lot of them had to do with scale, detail. So we've looked at I think the areas around the commercial areas, specifically the storefronts, also the area on, well, let's start on Washington Street. If you look at the upper corner, there's step terraces. Specifically on the upper left, you can see that we've taken those terraces and stepped them, unlike previously where they ended up considerably out of the ground. To the right, lower right, you can see that we don't have great graphics of this, and we don't have a colored elevation of this corner. This kind of opens up as we move around the building. There were comments about access to the loggia on the right-hand side of the Luigi Street elevation. We've created a much larger access stair aligned with entry to the building. You see the last colored elevation above, the lower elevation below. You can see on the far right the stairs to the entry. We have, in addition on this entry, have done additional detailing both at the lintels and using inset steel. We're using C-channels at the lintels, using basically a variety of steel components, maybe, I guess, not in a really literal homage to, or maybe too literal to the fact that Klein Steel was on the site, but we've chosen basically a palette of steel elements to accentuate both the vertical pilasters and also the lintels above the buildings. I have an enlarged elevation. You can see that you can see the lintels. We've also worked on a number of the canopies, creating kind of a steel lintel detail as well. The storefronts are all set in 2 feet. Previously, they were flush with the brick to give a little more relief, a little more texture. In that inset, we've pulled in planter boxes with flowers and that will be maintained by the management. They're steel planter boxes. They're permanent planter boxes. They're not sort of mobile. They'll be irrigated. The light color is actually matches it just didn't show up that well in the rendering, matches the lintels, and it's a steel channel. On top of that channel, we propose LED lights that will form, be up and down lights that we've had success with in the past. I'm going to move on to the Lady Street elevation. At the commercial storefronts around the corner of Lady Street, a similar, design strategy. And as we move further down, there were concerns about the scale of the building as it stepped down. We've made additional detailing at the base of the balconies as the building, extends below the floor elevation. We've rusticated the brick, which is a strategy I know the architects understand, but in this case, every 4th course will be projected, and that'll create kind of a shadow below the floor line. We have also provided planter boxes on either side of the garage access. And by the way, we've eliminated a great deal of the darker brick. I think I should probably go back, and you can see that previously, if you look at the top slide, you'll see that we had the brown brick wrapping the corner. We agreed that there's a lot more uniformity, I think, design consistency by using a single brick And so we've reserved the darker brick for, I'm sorry. We've reserved the darker brick for just specific accent elements like the stoops and balconies in this location. One of the things that the client has committed to is an art program for the site, and we thought a really positive location for the art was, rather than just doing some sort of stationary sculpture, to make it integrated with this gateway concept that linked Lady Street to the State Museum property. And so this is absolutely not what we're proposing, but this is the location that we're proposing it in. And, you know, so that you will see it on axes with Lady as you enter the site off of UG, just in the lower right, an example of kind of some gateway art that we had commissioned last year that was installed earlier this summer. The concept being that it'll be tall enough to be seen and sort of signal the connector through to the museum property, but also, and I think I said before, it would be our intent to commission an artist with the idea that the art would pay homage to Klein Steel. Building 2, primarily the comments were directed to the far left side, basically the south side of the building, and the south elevation, east and west elevations. Similar to the previous plan, building 1, I should say, we you know, changed the brick at the corner from the brown to the red brick. We made similar proposed design interventions at the storefront, setting it back using very similar steel details. This may be different than building 1. I would hope that we would develop something that was a little different palette, but for place saver purposes, this shows our intent. I think one of the conditions was that we come back with, in the future, with a more detailed presentation of enlarged storefront details. So the upper left-hand corner is essentially the revised proposed design. You can see the flower boxes and so forth. Wrapping the corner, there were a couple concerns. Well, I think 3 specific concerns, or maybe 4. I think Gervais Street took a lot of, occupied a lot of the conversation last week. There were concerns about the scale of the height of the windows. There were concerns about that particular elevation being not unlike all the other elevations, perhaps looking at the broader context of this building on Gervais Street. The pedestrian experience on Gervais Street, specifically how it interfaced with the courtyard, and as one moved further down Gervais Street, how, because the first level was so far out of the ground, how to mitigate the scale of that condition. And then I think Mr. Savory had, I think, a great comment about what anchors the corner of this building as you approach from the southwest. So similar strategy on the storefront, stepping it back 2 feet, adding the planters. We pulled the height of those windows down. You still see the steel lintels. We added standing seam metal canopies, at least that's the intention right now. At the courtyard, we have step planters, much more elaborate step planters that step closer down to seat height, and created a pergola gateway at the entry to the courtyard. I mean, it's still a private courtyard, but we wanted at least to that scale to be not so for boating between the sidewalk and the courtyard. Further down, we've broken the windows into what is the yoga studio with sunshade structures at a mid-level. So there's transom windows above that, and then step planters, which you can also see. I'm looking for, yeah, so let me go to this one and go back. This is really to show the change in the elevation. We've removed the porches that were on this elevation and shifted them to the inside of the courtyard to create a little more of, I think, a masonry facade. It still has elements, obviously, that tie back into the larger project. And so this is probably the best slide as you approach the building from the southwest. There's a corner tower. There's also additional detail along the back side, before the parking deck. So the building really, as we looked at it, did appear to be a little bit of an afterthought, the design of this edge of the building. So at the top elevation is really the elevation that you would see as you approach from the southwest, and there's a kind of an anchor tower of sorts in that location. This also shows the rusticated brick below the floor elevation that's consistent with the treatment on Building 1 as well. One of the conditions is that we come back with more detail on the screen of the parking deck. I hope you appreciate that it's a very complicated design exercise, specifically as it relates to cost. So we're exploring a number of different opportunities to screen the deck. I mean, the commitment's there to do so, and to do so in an elegant way. One of the comments has been, how do we screen the mechanical equipment? I had outlined that the mechanical equipment on these larger multifamily projects is typically located, each residential unit has a heat pump, so there's a whole lot of them. But you also don't want them above the residential units, and so they're located traditionally along the corridor for sound attenuation reasons. But that also creates a location that is easily screened. So just diagrammatically, how you would be hard-pressed to ever see the mechanical units. That's our presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any thoughts from any of the commission? Any questions? Thank you, sir. Is there anyone here who has anything additionally to add or to say in opposition to this project? Sir?
Hi, my name is Steve Henson. I live in the Vista, and I'm on the Vista Neighborhood Association. And just want to make a few comments. The developer was nice enough to meet with us, along with some other people in advance. And I mean, we're excited about the Klein building and the development that's going to take that basically empty lot there as you enter Columbia. We think that's good. But we are a little bit concerned about the height of the hotel. Now, we're not really talking about the hotel portion today. But I think the hotel is planned to be an 8-story building. I think the scale of the rest of the buildings is, you know, around 5 floors, I think. We're a little concerned about the height of the hotel, which hadn't been planned, and again, we're not talking about it in detail today. I think that originally, and we know this is a PUD, so there's probably not much we can do about the height of the hotel. And I know originally it was, I think, 110 feet, and now that maximum height's been lowered to 90. I guess our primary concern is kind of the future. We've already built the Hyatt Place, which some of us thought was too tall, and we built the Aloft, both of which are about 6 floors. And now we've got an 8-story building, and proposed, I think, for the hotel. We're just concerned about the future. I mean, most Vista residents don't want a high-rise Vista. So we're worried about the future of those height restrictions. I know we're going through zoning now. We're going to have new zoning requirements coming up in the next year or year and a half. So we just wanted to put our 2 cents in, not so much about the specifics that we're talking about today, but the future. And, you know, we always look at the height of the surrounding buildings. Well, the surrounding buildings are getting bigger and bigger, and we have some concern about that as far as the scale of the Vista going forward. So thanks.
Thank you, sir. Once again, are there any comments or thoughts from any of the commissioners on the presentation?
Mr. Chairman, I had a question. The staff in their written recommendations have about 6 recommendations that were highlighted, and I didn't know whether the developer and architectural team was aware of those, and if they were aware of them, are they willing to try to incorporate those pending a favorable motion?
The evaluation and the comments have been provided to the design team.
Yes, we are aware of them, and we are prepared to comply.
Very good. Any other comments, Mr. Savory or anyone?
One thing I would say is that I think that the changes that you've made in the design, they're all steps in the right direction. So I know I appreciate it. I'm sure other commissioners appreciate it. And with respect to Mr. Gressett's comments and the questions about the comments from staff, I would agree that there are some portions, particularly on the west facade, specifically the parking garage, that I don't feel that we've seen enough there yet. I think that if I understood your presentation correctly, you would be, you expect to, and would be amenable to bringing more detail back. I like the idea of the steel lintel. I think it's a nice detail. Some of those details you described a little bit more verbally than you did visually, so it's hard to understand, but I think all of the revisions that you've made have been in the right direction.
Thank you. I think at this time, unless anyone else has anything else to add, what I would like to state, though, for the record here, is that this is a request for certificate of design approval for Buildings 1 and Building 2 solely at 1221, 1301 Huger Street, Hugie, better known to most, 401 to 433 Gervais Street. And I believe that if we are going to enjoy a motion, that we consider that a motion would be made applying all of the facts to all of the guidelines. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make the motion that we grant a certificate of design approval for 1221, 1301 UG Street, 401, 433 Gervais Street, based on the staff's recommendations. Should I read those?
Yes, please.
Okay. Which would include to grant the requests with these considerations: the larger scaled detailed elevations of street-facing facades be submitted for review as they are further developed. Item 2, the parking garage design be developed to ensure a high level of finish and screening of vehicles and ramping. Item 3, the landscape plan be revised to include more shade trees along sidewalks and evergreen screening on exposed elevations of the parking garage. Number 4, the pedestrian connection to the State Museum be reviewed in detail and approved by staff as it is further developed. Number 5, rooftop screening and other utility equipment, transformers, etc., be reviewed for locations and screening. And finally, signage shall be submitted separately or certificates of design approval, certificates of design approval.
Thank you, Mr. Gressett. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you, Mr. Bucknight. We have a second. Is there any discussion?
I just wanted to clarify, maybe it's clear enough, but it seems like there are a couple of different levels of review that are in all of these different conditions. I want to clarify that the first condition, the larger scale detail elevations and the parking garage design, that those are components that will come back before the commission. There are some other conditions in there that are specifically items that specifically go back for staff consideration. So I just want to be clear that we know which is which. So it would be the first, as I see it, at least the first 2 conditions. Those would be items that would come back before the commission, in addition to the signage, which is separate. Is that correct?
Lucinda, is that?
I think that's at the desire of the commission. If y'all want to see those things, I think perhaps just clarifying that in the motion would be the right way to go.
Very good. We'll have Mr. Gressett restate, please, if you will, the motion. Okay.
I think you can just amend the motion to
amend that
include
motion.
Tom's comments.
Tom, did you say the first 2
That's the
specifically?
first 2.
The
I think the
first-
last one also comes back, but that's very clear. So I think the first 2 are the only 2.
To include the first 2 items of concern as stated by staff in their review comments.
Very good. So we have a motion that has been amended. Is there a second?
Second?
Okay, we have second. Any further discussion? That being the case, we will have a roll call, please.
Mr. Bucknight?
Yes.
Ms. Great?
Yes.
Mr. Gressett?
Yes.
Mr. Herger?
Yes.
Mr. Cohn?
Yes.
Mr. Powell?
Yes.
Mr. Savory?
Yes.
Mr. Nguyen?
Yes.
The motion passes.
Very good. Thank you very much. We have, excuse me, at this time, a presentation on the Canal Side Phase 3, an information-only presentation, I believe.
That's correct. The next item on the agenda is a presentation of the last 3 parcels for the Canal Side development. This is, just as a little bit of background, this is the 3rd and final phase of the Canal Side project. The PUD zoning document was approved in 2005, and the infrastructure package in Phase 1 included construction of several multifamily buildings and was approved in 2007. Phase 2 included multifamily buildings and townhomes and was approved in 2011. And the PUD document was included in your packet for informational purposes. There were some additional design objectives as part of that document that this commission will look at in addition to the City Center Design Development Guidelines, which is the district that this project is in. So today's just for information. There was a number of concerns that staff has discussed with the applicant, so we recommended that they just come to get your feedback. So Ned Miller is here from the Beach Company, and he's going to do the presentation.
Thanks, Lucinda. First off, I think that was very helpful, coming in behind the project ahead of us. I've worked with Jay Davis and,
Let me just have you state your name.
oh, I'm sorry, Ned Miller with the Beach Company, Charleston.
Thank you, sir.
So thanks for taking the time and going through the informational process.
I
with
guess
that.
another question. Were you here at the time of swearing in?
I was not, no.
Okay, thank you. I just reminded that you may not have been. If you'll raise your right hand, please. Do you swear to tell the truth in these proceedings?
I do.
Very good, thank you.
So we recognize that there are improvements that need to be made to be consistent with the objectives of the PUD design guidelines and objectives. So my hope today is that we can go over a little bit of what we've got planned for that, those changes, but also to get some constructive feedback from you all as if you were looking to vote on this today, in the hope that we can come back next time a little better prepared and hopefully cut down the process and save your time as well. So with that said, I think there were several things in the staff report. The biggest issue was how the, is there a pointer on this at all, or is it? Oh, okay. Well, I guess if you've got, yeah, so on Plan North on the right side, we've got Block 1, that's buildings 1, 2, and 3. Building 3, the staff reported that there's concerns about how it addresses the street and treats the pedestrian interaction. And then there were similar comments on Building 4, which is the next block over along the canal and on the north side of the park, on Plan North. And so the other building was Plan 6, or Building 6, that is a smaller building on the bottom lot where there's parking underneath, some tuck-under parking. And so we recognize that there's some improvements that need to be made with the facades to create more of a pedestrian-friendly interaction. And to address that, we're proposing to let me get to the plans. So this is Building 1, which we feel does a pretty good job, and I think staff generally agreed with that. This is the way this addresses the street. This is Building 2. This contains the leasing office. You can see on the sketch plan, the site plan on the right, it's showing elevation number 1 there. And where the canal side sign is, that is the leasing office. So that's more of a commercial treatment. And we've got some detailing on the brick. We recognize that we'll have to add some larger elevations to show you more of that detail. But the white elements you see there are sort of painted white brick, and I believe they're recessed just to give it a little different look. Some of the comments in general for this site were that there needed to be more treatments at the street level. And I think specifically for this one, there's the canopy there, and one comment was to bring it down to the first floor to make it more pedestrian friendly, and we can certainly look at doing that. I think the reason it's there is because that's a 2-level space, double height ceiling, and it made sense to do that. So this is Building 3, and this is the one where one of the buildings where there are concerns about how it addresses the street. So we're proposing to put in, change the units to townhomes, where the feel of it would be more similar to what happened in Phase 2, where you have stoops at the street level. And we would keep some of the parking on the ground level, and but would have more formal entrances for the residents of the building across the street to access their spaces that would be in this building. Moving along, this is Building 4. This is it's actually a podium building with parking underneath. And the challenge challenges that we are facing, we are adding commercial space to this phase of the project, but there are concerns about the economic viability of it. We've put most of that in the third block, and one of the staff's comments was that this building doesn't really address the park and doesn't create a good pedestrian experience at this level. We've got the main entrance there, sort of in the middle, where you see people going in with the storefront glass going all the way up, and then another entrance right next to it. So we would propose actually adding a liner row of units, or not units, flex space, possible flex space, to open this building up at this elevation. This is the canal side elevation, and we would be adding some more flex space here with a bike station, bike shop kind of thing where residents could go in and out and have a formal storefront entrance, and adding an additional entrance to the building. And then moving on, this is the canal elevation where I think in general we've made a lot of changes to add this kind of grand staircase entrance to the building, which helps it open up to the promenade. And then moving on, this is Building 5, which is in Block 3. And again, this is the same kind of building that we had as Building 3 with the tuck-under parking. And again, we would do the same kind of thing here, add townhome units to open it up, and also add some outdoor kitchens to where it's more open, where the building kind of has that elbow, the inside of the elbow. Add some outdoor space for the residents that would be more active, to help fill in that space and create a space that's going to be used as opposed to just walk by. And finally, here is the commercial building, commercial elevation. Appreciate any comments you have on this. The goal here is to put a restaurant on the right side of the building, which would be overlooking the canal, and have outdoor seating, and then have a flex event space on the left side with offices in the middle. And that's all storefront with sort of a canopy above. And then lastly, this is the canal elevation of the same building, where we anticipate having flex office space in this section to the right of where you see the larger storefront windows. So based on the staff comments, the architect over the last week put together some changes, and this is an initial look at what he's come up with. This is Building 3, which is along Canal Side. And so we've eliminated some of the parking and added these townhome entries with sort of patios and stoops. I'd just like to note also that anywhere you see sort of a patio at the ground level, for the most part, those would be stoops. They're not enclosed patios, so they would be an active entrance to the building, similar to what we had in Phase 2. So again, here we're instead of where before I don't think there were any openings into the building, we now have 7. And we're still continuing to tweak this, but this is the direction that we're headed, and we'll work with staff on reviewing. But again, any comments that you have today would be greatly appreciated. And another thing we're going to do is you can see sort of the pedestrian access, adding canopies. And another note is I think staff had a comment on the cornice line. I think part of it may have just been in the drawings. We need to do a better job of showing how those are defined. They're probably going to be similar to what was done on Phase 2. But you can see here, there's sort of some variation in height and some elements that protrude farther out than others. But any comments on that are appreciated. This is the first look at changing the elevation on the podium building on Block 2. And here we're adding some more canopies at the first floor, as well as some storefront on the corner for that flex space, flex office. and some additional pedestrian units and more formal entrances. And then here is the other, you can see it in plan where on the right side, we're eliminating some parking, which is a concern, but we do have enough across the street to accommodate that. And then lastly, here is building 5, where I think we still need to define that little, where you see the tables there in the elbow. I think it would be more of an active space with outdoor kitchens, but you can see the townhome entries, the 4 entrances on the right, and then a more formal breezeway in the middle. So I think that was it. Any, if there's any questions I can answer or any comments, I would greatly appreciate it so we can take another run at it.
Thank you, sir. Any comments or questions from the commissioners?
Any materials or anything on that the windows,
I was actually having a
recess?
little trouble following all that, so I'll
Sure,
apologize.
I understand, yeah.
Right up front. One of the comments that I guess I read was maybe a general statement that the staff was encouraging you to actually increase the density some as Canal Side has been built out and is, successful and now in the final phases, and that it could actually use maybe a little bit more density than what I think I understand are a lot more 3-story structures. So I don't know whether any other members kind of caught up on that, if that's a valid criticism that you might want to address. That and the, I guess, a lot of use of parking within the building, sort of forfeiting that ground space that would enhance the pedestrian experience. So I guess those were maybe some of my concerns.
Yeah, we've got, we'll continue to discuss with staff. I know there's some language in the PUD that requires a minimal amount, and, we've discussed alternatives if there's a 4th phase, but right now in this construction cost climate and the viability of delivering 400 units, this is a big enough project where it becomes a little economically challenging, considering we already have 300 units there, but we'll continue to address that with staff.
Thank you, Mr. Gressett. Anyone else? Mr. Saber?
I would echo Ashby's comments, and also I think that staff did a very good job of reviewing this for us and making recommendations to you. This is the crown jewel on Canal Side that we've all been waiting for a very long time. There's been a lot of infrastructure put in terms of how the canal wall itself has been built, and I would encourage you to do everything that you can, particularly to make Building 4 the experience as a pedestrian experience along the canal, an exciting pedestrian experience. I think everybody's hope is that this will become a very vital, part of downtown Columbia. I know if it were in downtown Charleston, there would be a lot of focus on it, and we want, to have the same amount of focus, of course, in our city. I think that Building 6, to my mind, is probably the most successful building from the standpoint of program and urbanistically, the way that it addresses the canal and addresses the termination of Taylor Street. I share the same concerns that staff has articulated in their synopsis about the screening of parking and the fact that so many of the structures are on top of parking, so that so much of the pedestrian experience is one of passing cars and parking, even though there's some attempt at screening it. Those would be the concerns that I would have. I would tie them back to the guidelines and back to the intention of the PUD. I think that, again, Building 4 in my mind, is challenging because of the fact that it's really the street wall faces the street, but what faces the canal, which is really in effect a street wall from the standpoint of pedestrian experience, breaks down more and becomes more of an experience of steps and terraces rather than engaged pedestrian activity at the edge of the street wall. So I would have some concerns about that. And the only other thing I would say is, like Ashby, I took some time yesterday to review this, and then watching your presentation, I got confused again. There's so many buildings. One thing that would help tremendously in the presentation, the way that the key plans are in there in the lower right-hand corners is helpful, but the problem is that everything is oriented 90 degrees differently.
Sure.
It would be helpful to have the key plans be the same as the master plan, as the overall plan, and even to actually, if the overall plan in a very diagrammatic way could be there so that as we flip through it, we understand, and when you present it, we understand which buildings, because I mean, the buildings are all really sort of architecturally all kind of the same. So it's difficult to take it in as we're going through that. And speaking of that, to me, it would be more interesting if some of the comments we had on the last project when they were here last month, if the facades that are facing the more public areas were differentiated more from the facades that are not facing the more public areas. You know, the architecture in that district, the original architecture, the historic architecture, is pretty simple. It's long expanses of masonry with deeply recessed windows, load-bearing masonry construction. And it's really rich as a result of that. If there could be some differentiation taking into account the historic buildings in the nearby district, and differentiating some between what is really you consider to be the public facades and what are more private and secondary facades, that might help, because generally speaking, everything looks kind of the same.
Yeah, are you, as far as the parking, these elevations
Well, that
here?
doesn't.
So
That looks
this,
a lot different from the others.
Yeah.
But generally, the breakdown of the rhythm and the use of the materials is pretty similar from building to building. So there might be a way, for instance, you know, as the buildings face the termination of Taylor Street, as they face the Esplanade, as opposed to, what are these streets? You know, Canal Side Street and some of the secondary streets. Some differentiation there might be appropriate.
okay.
Could you go back to the elevations and just give us a briefing on what some of the materials are?
Sure.
I mean, it looks a little nervous to me.
This is kind of what I'm getting at.
Here's-
Sort of the same level of nervousness kind of repeated on every facade.
Well, here's the materials. It's basically two brick colors, and then different colors of hardy panel and some lap siding. And then there's few elements of that composite wood at stairwells. And you can see the composite wood here at the opening on building 1 elevation at the top left, whereas
About roughly what percentage of that is brick?
I don't know, I guess it varies by elevation. We could,
But just, I mean, is that, am I reading 10% brick or 50%?
no, it's probably somewhere between 25 and 50, but depending on the elevation. I think as you get to the larger buildings, there's more brick on the bottom 2 floors. Here, you know, this is sort of consistent with actually the Phase 1 buildings where they were all brick, and sort of harkening back to that warehouse kind of feel on the left side. But as it's more residential, it gets the materials become more varied.
To me, I think what Tom was talking of, but to me also it's kind of a sense of permanence. The brick to me is a lot more permanent looking building than just a bunch of different colored hardy plank or whatever, you know, with a little brick
Okay. I think the intent was definitely at the pedestrian level to have brick. And here you see it going up to the third floor on the left end. But understood that,
I'd like to ask if you show again the elevations that are canal side and promenade facing.
sure. This is in Block 2 on the north side of the site. And so this is the southern end of that building.
So as I followed you
Yeah.
through your presentation, the areas that you propose to have restaurants and/or retail are not on the canal side of
They're
any of
not,
the-
there's, in the building 6, again, I apologize for the confusing plan, but this elevation would be entirely commercial at the ground floor, but primarily office use is our thought, and it's hard to say at this point. I mean, it's a little difficult because this is a dead-end street, and so it's a little unclear what kind of retail we're going to get in here, but
I would
fairly
offer-
confident. Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I would offer the idea that perhaps you might consider, as you work with staff, enlarging the presence of retail, restaurant, and pedestrian-friendly along the canal side and promenade areas, considering the city's view of what this future canal is really going to present to and for the city, and might add quite a bit. You have an opportunity there.
Yeah, I think that, our hope is that this elevation would be active with the restaurant. We'll continue to review that with staff. It's a little challenging from the economic side, if I'm being honest. It's
Understood.
just being where this site's located, but we'll continue to look at that, and I understand that activating the street and the canal is important. So,
Great.
I'm correct that this is where you're proposing the restaurant?
that's correct.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
this is commercial along here, correct?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, I think that's, Bob, I don't know, they're proposing the restaurant here, and then it's commercial all through here, and then that's office space along there, which, I mean, I think ideally you would have more restaurants, obviously, it would be preferable, but I think that, the direction of making this commercial space of some sort is the right direction. I guess what I'm wondering is, when you get up here, I mean, we see these facades are quite a ways back, but, they're still pretty plain. A lot of that could be mitigated if you just could put some, even a small restaurant, something here that would be not just for the residents of this block. I don't think, to my mind, it wouldn't have to be really robust, but if there were just some kind of destination there of some sort, that would be helpful. I guess what I'm wondering, and getting back to Ashby's question, the question about the amount of brick, in my mind, and other commissioners chime in if you have a different thought, but I don't know if you have any brick facing the parking lots, but if you do, it seems to me that the brick is kind of the precious commodity. It would be best to put that in the public realm.
That's a good point, and I'm not sure how much we have at those elevations. Definitely at Block 3, I think there may be some.
I think it would be fine to
yeah.
differentiate that way.
I think to some extent, we've already done that, but there may be an opportunity to do more of that. I just want to add that there is, in this elevation, there's about 10,000 square feet, excuse me, of commercial space set aside. And, I'd love if it was all restaurants. And if there's anyone watching this online that's looking to open a restaurant, we'd love to get them in there. That would be our hope. But the reality is something different. We're going to pursue it, do everything we can to get as much of that kind of space in there. But the reality as we found in Phase 1, it was a real challenge to lease the space, and it sat empty. So,
Just to add one more comment, and I think this has been reflected in several of the others, the color scheme, which is sitting in front of me right now, I'll keep passing it. I was flipping through a black and white copy as you were presenting in color.
sorry.
And to be perfectly honest, I found the black and white version much more compelling. And so I would just reiterate some of the comments, the historic consistency of elevations. Maybe it doesn't need to be quite so dynamic. Maybe it could be simplified. Maybe the color scheme doesn't need to be quite so
fewer colors.
sporadic. And I think it can be, I think it can simply be streamlined, and it actually be more cost effective and allow you to perhaps use more brick in key places. And I think that's been sort of spoken to in other ways, but just to reiterate it from one more.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Brick more selectively
Not
located?
necessarily. There's so much movement in the elevation,
Yeah.
and obviously that drives up cost. Some of the historic buildings in this area were not so complex. And I think if you reduce the color palette and by that reduce the amount of movement we were trying to achieve with that, you could take some of those dollars and put it into higher grade finishes. And obviously that's just a comment, but it was driven by the idea that in looking at the massing, I think the massing is good. When we get to the color scheme, all of those masses start looking like different pieces and parts, and it's far
Too
more
busy.
broken up in color than it is in black and white. And so I think there's opportunities without changing necessarily a great deal of the architecture
Sure.
to make this more effective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a good point. Understood.
Well, thank you, sir.
Well, thank
We've-
you for your
We've
comments.
enjoyed it. We'll look
Appreciate
forward
it.
to a presentation in the future.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have 3320 Murray Street, I believe, to come before us.
That's correct. We're moving to the historic portion of the agenda, and Stacy Ritchie will be presenting for 3320 Murray Street.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you click to it? Is he getting it? All right, just a minute. Technical difficulties. Well, I'll go ahead and start presenting. Unfortunately, the owner couldn't be here today. He's out of town, or the applicant, rather. This is a circa 1947 single-family, single-story home with a brick veneer located in Melrose Heights, Oak Lawn Architectural Conservation District. It does contribute to that district, despite the fact that it has had an addition to the back, because it does retain its original form and character along the facade and front of both side elevations. The applicant is requesting to paint the brick in this color palette on the bottom right. We do not review colors. However, we do review painting of unpainted brick. And the guidelines for this area indicate that bond patterns, coatings, and colors and tooling of original masonry should be retained. Due to that, we are making a recommendation that the applicant's request does not meet Section 7 of the guidelines and recommends a denial. Just for your information, these are some of the surrounding buildings. The two brick buildings located here are approximately 10 years older than the building in question, but they show the differences in the detailing that occurred over time in this location. Do you have any questions?
Any questions from commissioners? None? And we have no applicant.
If I can ask, this is the first time I've ever heard that color is in our purview, and I just made a large comment about color scheme. So just for clarification.
Not
is it-
for historic, just not
No,
for our
Historic
historic.
districts, color is a factor.
historic district's color is not a factor.
Okay. But in this case, the color is something that's being reviewed. I see in the guidelines how.
Well, retaining
It's
original
the painting of
masonry,
the masonry,
the original masonry
Period.
color.
not the color.
Paint colors, I should say. We do not review paint colors.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there anyone here for or against this petition or application? The owner's not here. Any other comments from the commissioners?
Was the owner given the opportunity to defer this project, knowing that he or she wouldn't be available for this meeting?
They were kind of, just wanted to have your full support, and if they did not have it, they would not pursue the painting. So this is an investment property, from what I understand. That
Very
was our
good. If there are no other comments, is there a motion on this application?
I'll make a motion then. I move that we deny the certificate of design approval for 3320 Murray Street.
Is this motion, sir, just to have it fully defined, based on section 7.6
Yes,
as presented, yes?
based on section 7-6, exterior siding, specifically with respect to painting the original existing masonry facade.
Very good. Is there a second? Second. We have a second. Any further discussion? Would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Bachnight? Yes. Ms. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Gressett?
Yes.
Mr. Herger?
Yes.
Mr. Cohn?
Yes.
Mr. Powell?
Yes.
Mr. Savory?
Yes.
Mr. Nguyen?
Yes.
The motion passes.
Motion for
Denial.
denial
Passes.
passes. Thank you. We have another case now before us. I believe it's the
We do.
1321 Lady Street.
This is, as y'all know, a landmark building in the city that came to you recently for the Bailey Bill. It's a 1949 building, and it's, a very simple, streamlined building. The Bailey Bill application was submitted to do several things to the building, bringing back the entry, adding some windows at the back on the annex, various and sundry things. Rehabilitating the windows was one point in question that we'd gone over with the applicant and really struggled with. And they have proceeded further down the road, agreeing first to rehabilitate the windows, but then really taking a look at what it meant to rehabilitate steel windows that are embedded in the concrete and which have wire glass, security glass in them. So staff has been discussing this issue with them. We took an inventory of the windows, which are very different because there have been some substitutions over time. There's, first top two stories have plain glass. Front of the building basically has plain glass, but where you really see some of the security glass is on the west elevation and towards the sidewalk on the north elevation from the public right-of-way. So the applicants took out some panes of glass in a window on the north elevation and rehabilitated that window. Took the bronze tint, which was not original but which was applied later, off of the windows to get an idea really of what the original windows might have looked like. So the security glass is not as visible without the bronze tint. It is much more subtle, where we need to determine really how much of that you're going to see from the public right-of-way, especially on the upper stories. So the tension here is between keeping historic materials, because this is indeed a Bailey Bill project, and the difficulties inherent in trying to rehabilitate all of these windows and trying to maintain a reasonable regard for the historic properties of the building. So staff was not comfortable doing that entirely at staff level, but wanted to bring it back to y'all to say, we really need to take some bronze tint off of the upper windows, see how visible they are, and to see if y'all were comfortable leaving this with staff with the idea that at least the first 2 stories, we'd probably retain most of the original security glass where we could, and replacing where we couldn't, where it's been broken or replaced with inappropriate glass with glass from other parts of the building. The idea being that it may be plain glass up top where it's not as visible, and where we may not see any security glass at all, and we can take those panels out and use them further down. But really, it requires an assessment of how much you can actually see without that tint on more windows.
Thank you, ma'am. Any thoughts from the commission? Or Mr. Prioreshi, do you have anything to present or add, sir? Can you step to the podium and use the mic, please?
I said I think that Amy described the situation pretty well. We're asking for a compromise because after we got into really realizing what the problem was, we think we're going to have a significant, the same problem that they had since the building opened, we believe, which is a leakage problem on the design. They had to hold the chicken wire glass in. And so we came back and sought relief. I mean, that's really the bottom line. I mean, I don't know what else to say.
Thank you, sir. Any questions from Commission?
In this motion, we're simply giving staff the authority to make these decisions from window to window and from floor to floor, rather than saying the whole building or basically.
Yes.
I went over, actually, and because it's pretty convenient, I went over and took a look at the sample window, and it makes a huge difference to take that nasty tinting off. And you're right, for some reason, it kind of obscures the visibility of the wire. I've looked at it from all different angles, and I couldn't figure out why that would be the case, but it does. And I think it's because you get more visibility through the glass. So just from my own, just out of my own interest, my own edification, then is the idea going to ultimately be to put in the interior storms as per a typical historic renovation, or is that not?
We've certainly discussed a multitude of options with Mr. Prioreshi and Mr. Mashburn, you know, that's certainly an option if they choose to pursue that. And I think there's some discussion perhaps.
It doesn't really, I guess it doesn't
Yeah.
matter for our purposes, I was just curious.
Yeah.
And I think you already said it maybe, but this wire glass is not in the windows on the Lady Street facade.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear
The
you.
wire glass is not, the wire glass is not in the windows on the Lady Street facade, right? I thought it wasn't when I walked over there.
Not on the front.
Right.
No, they're
not
plain.
Not even on the front of the building. To me, I think that the overwhelmingly important part is that the original steel frames remain intact, and the tinting comes off, and that's just I mean, that's really terrific.
Anyone else? Mr. Gressett? Mr. Horner? That being the case, I think we are in line for a motion. Is there a motion on this 1321 Lady Street, please?
Still trying to figure out what the motion would be. Is the motion that we approve the request for proposed changes to the Bailey Bill at 1321 Lady Street for the first 2 floors?
I believe we're deferring to staff
I
the
think-
authority to modify.
Right, with the understanding that staff is interested in trying to maintain as much as we can on those first 2 floors, visible from the public right-of-way.
Does this in effect revise a prior motion that we'd made on this in terms of the Bailey bill, or is it simply a clarification of that?
Yeah, my belief and understanding here is that we have approved the project prior in terms of its Bailey bill
Eligibility.
approval or eligibility. Here, what we are being asked to do is to provide staff with the authority to move with Mr. Priorishi to determine window by window, as you said earlier, and floor by floor, the reasonable approaches that still fit the Bailey bill request to alter the glass presence, if you will, window by window. Is that state it?
Very well.
Okay, I'll give that a shot. For 1321 Lady Street, I make a motion that we give staff approval to move forward reviewing the windows based on visibility from the public right-of-way, and to work with the owners on determining which windows might be replaced, with the understanding that at least the first 2 to 3 floors of the windows on the annex and west elevations will remain historic materials, and the other floors as deemed appropriate by staff.
Second.
We have a second. Any further discussion? That being the case, would you call the roll, please, for a vote?
Mr. Bachnight? Yes. Ms. Grate?
Yes.
Mr. Gressett?
Yes.
Mr. Herger?
Yes.
Mr. Cohn?
Yes.
Mr. Powell?
Yes.
Mr. Savory?
Yes.
Mr. Nguyen?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. We next have the need to ask for a motion for the minutes of our prior meeting, which was August 13th. The minutes that you all may have had here on the commission prior to today have been amended, or
There is a comment from a commission member who would like to amend the minutes.
okay.
Yes, prior to the motion, I would like to just clarify under urban, item number 2, 1221 to 1301 Hughie Street, and 401 to 433 Gervais Street. Would like for the minutes to reflect that I asked a question rather than made a statement, if a certificate of design approval could be granted by deferring to staff.
Very good. Do we have a motion to accept the minutes now with this additional change?
So moved.
Okay, second?
Second.
We have a second. Any further discussion? That being the case, we can do a group vote here.
Mr. Bachnight? Ms. Grate?
Yes.
Mr. Gressett?
Yes.
Mr. Herger?
Yes.
Mr. Cohn? Mr. Powell?
Yes.
Mr. Savory?
Yes.
Mr. Nguyen?
Yes.
Motion passes.
Very good. Is there a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Very good. Second?
I'll second.
We have a second. The meeting is adjourned.